People always assume that the strangest things happen deep in the woods at night. But that trip, it taught me something different. The wilderness is unsettling, even in broad daylight. And sometimes you cannot explain what you saw, no matter how much you want to. I've tried for years to file everything away as stress or overactive imagination, something like that. But the more that time passes, the more the details stay sharp instead of fading. The whole ordeal started several years back, when my friend Gabe and I finally cleared out schedules for a long-talked-about hunting trip. We had chased mule deer all over the state before, but we'd always wanted to explore the high desert country far from the usual crowds. When we found an open window in mid-season, we loaded his old RV and we headed south, hoping for one good week off the grid. The drive down was easy enough. The land opened up into that red earth emptiness that only the lower ranges have, right? And the air grew colder and cleaner the farther we got from the city. By late afternoon, we were following dirt switchbacks toward a remote plateau, a place a co-worker of Gabe's had recommended. It was supposedly quiet and underhunted. When we finally parked, the view stretched for miles. Flat mesas slicing the horizon, pale cliffs crumbling in slow motion, and a silence so complete that it made your ears ring. We started unloading gear, joking, stretching stiff legs, normal stuff. But there was something about that place that made both of us speak softer, like we were standing in a church or something. Not fear exactly, just a strange sort of feeling in the air. Near the base of a crooked juniper nearby, we found something that really didn't belong there. A small bundle of sticks tied together with, strips of hide and dotted with old feathers. Sun-bleached and brittle now, because it had clearly been there for a while, but it looked handmade, old but deliberate. Gabe shrugged, and he assumed that it was somebody's discarded good luck charm or a marker from a bygone camp. He didn't hesitate to. He plucked it off the branch and tossed it into the bush so that it wouldn't rustle against our canopy lines. Now, the moment that it left that tree, I felt a weird sensation on the back of my neck. The kind that sort of makes you want to turn around, even if there isn't anything there, and I told myself that it was just nerves from a long drive and that I was tired. But that uneasiness, it became harder and harder to ignore as the days went on. The first couple of nights weren't terrible, they were just a little bit off, I would say. The air just sort of never settled in the usual quiet that I was expecting. There was always a faint noise, like a weird whispering sound, but too far to make sense of it or to even call it whispering. We would pause though, listen, and then blame the wind all the time. Except the trees were not moving, and neither was any of the brush around. On the third night, as we sat around a meager fire, a sound rolled out in the dark that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a low, wavering moan. It kind of sounded like a person mourning or something. It came from somewhere near the cliff's edge, lasted maybe half a minute, I would say, and then cut out so abruptly that it felt intentional. We barely slept that night, too. The next evening, something screamed from the tree line, a raw, guttural shriek that started like an animal but ended like someone choking on their own breath. We grabbed our rifles at that point and swept the area with flashlights, but we found nothing, not even so much as a broken twig. By the fifth day, the nights were full of weird things. Distant thumps, soft pattering in the dirt, something like chanting that faded whenever we got close enough to really hear it, and both of us were running on nerves and practically no sleep. But the first truly alarming moment, well, that came when we woke to the sound of an infant crying somewhere out there in the dark. Thin, desperate wailing that pulled at your heart. We called search and rescue because we genuinely believed that somebody had abandoned a baby out there too. The team, they searched everywhere, but there were no tracks, no footprints, no disturbed brush. There was no one out there. Later, while I was cleaning my rifle, I heard Gabe calling me from the tree line, clear as anything as well, excited like he had found something that he wanted me to see. I was halfway to him as well before his actual voice sounded behind me from near the RV. "Yo, Will, who are you talking to, man?" I turned so fast that I nearly fell, staring between him and the place where someone or something had just mimicked him. The shapes in the tree shifted with the wind, and when I pointed, he didn't laugh or tell me that I'd imagined it. He just sort of swallowed and double-checked the slide on his rifle. That night, we got maybe 2 hours of sleep before everything escalated again, and honestly, I don't know why we hadn't even left by now. But a scraping sound circled the RV, then a sort of rhythmic tapping, then a full-body slam that genuinely shook the whole frame of the RV. It came again, harder, making the cabinets rattle. Gabe grabbed his rifle, convinced that we were dealing with a massive predator now, flung the door open and fired 3 shots into the dark, and the last thing that we heard was a sort of deep, ragged groan, followed by something large crashing through the brush at a speed that genuinely did not make any sense. Well, at dawn we stepped out carefully. The ground was all sorts of torn up, saplings bent, dirt gouged, and near one corner of the RV was a set of enormous tracks, nothing that we recognized. There were drops of blood trailed away from the site, and we followed them for a bit. Neither of us spoke as we did so, but the trail, it led us toward a sort of narrow part of the cliff base, to a really old gnarly tree with roots exposed like rib bones out of the earth. The prints and the blood both stopped there, right beneath a branch holding something that we hadn't noticed before. A weather-worn bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth, tucked under the limbs like it had been placed there deliberately a long time ago. Gabe stood underneath it without realizing, tracing the prints and trying to make sense of them. I couldn't bring myself to step any closer to it. I just stared, feeling that same heavy feeling again from earlier, the one from the first day, only stronger now, as if the land itself was holding its breath. We didn't argue, though. We didn't theorize, and we didn't rationalize it either. We backed away, returned to camp, and we packed faster than I thought was even possible. During the drive home, neither of us said much. We kept turning to check the road behind us without really meaning to, and when we got back to Salt Lake, we didn't really make any promises about returning there either. We didn't even celebrate finishing the trip like we had planned to. People we've told this story to, they always ask if we think that it was an animal or a person messing with us or something like that, or if we were just overtired and maybe imagining things. I genuinely wish that I could accept any of those answers too. Life would be a whole lot easier if I could. But in this instance, I genuinely have no idea what any of that really was. People around here don't share certain stories unless, well, you've lived in these hills long enough to understand the way that the woods sound at night. Outsiders, they laugh or they call it superstition, but folks who grew up tucked between these ridgelines, they learn early on that not everything follows the rules of the living. What I'm about to describe isn't a single event, it's a pattern, something threaded through decades of retellings. I only pieced it together slowly from older relatives who finally talked when they were certain that I was old enough not to scare easy. But even then, they spoke about it the same way that you talk about an old injury, quietly, carefully, and like it still aches when it rains. So, it all started with something simple, footsteps. Not phantom shapes in the mist or glowing eyes or anything dramatic like that. Just footsteps that refused to match the world around them. People walking the old rural road that cuts behind the farms here would say that they heard someone pacing from on the opposite side, deep in the tree line. If they slowed down, the steps hesitated. If they stopped, everything went still. But the moment that they started again, the steps resumed, matching the rhythm perfectly. My father said that it's the one story everyone in that part of the county always quietly agrees on. No one ever claims to see anything. No figure, no animal, no hint of breath or movement, just the steady crunch of leaves shadowing your own stride as if something you cannot name refuses to fall behind. Locals came up with all sorts of explanations too. Restless spirits, lost wanderers, mountain folklore tied to older beliefs, but most simply called it the follower. They didn't mean it in a dramatic or demonic sense or anything. It was just something out there that didn't behave the way that it should have. My uncle's encounter, it's the one that people still bring up when the nights run late. He was out hunting one autumn well past midnight, carrying his old bolt action and running a small pack of seasonal hounds. These dogs, they had chased off coyotes, bobcats, even the occasional black bear. I mean, nothing rattled them. He said, though, that the forest felt wronged at the moment that he stepped off of the logging trail, way too still and almost expectant. The hounds, they froze, tails tucked, ears flat. He tried urging them forward, but they wouldn't cross onto a patch of shadow lying between two oaks. They just whimpered there. Then he heard something. Brush shifting rapidly, circling him in uneven bursts. Not like a single animal, and not like anything tracking its prey, but more like something testing boundaries, like darting closely and then retreating just out of sight. The hounds all pressed against his legs, shaking. He didn't fire the gun, he didn't call out either. He just began backing up on the path, trying not to run. But as he picked up speed, so did this thing in the tree line. He heard it pacing him, matching him, advancing when he did, stopping when he dared to check behind. By the time that he reached the clearing of his yard, the noise had halted, like a door had slammed shut behind him. The dogs bolted straight into the house. He followed, locked everything, and sat awake until dawn that day. My grandmother swore that he was pale and trembling the next morning too, the kind of shaking that she had only ever seen from war veterans before, and after that, he refused to hunt alone. Years later, my mother shared another story too, one that she kept to herself because she hated talking about it apparently. Her childhood family friend lived alone in a rundown house buried so deep in the woods that you had to walk a half-mile from the nearest road just to reach it. He'd chosen the place for quiet apparently, but instead, the quiet began to turn on him. He told my grandmother that he hadn't slept properly in months, and not because of nightmares, but because something physically kept him awake. Windows would rattle hard enough to shake the dust from the frames, cabinets would fly open into the dead of night. He said that he heard knocks on the walls, one after another, like something searching for a way inside. Mind you, she swore that it wasn't theatrical the way that he said it. It was activity that made a home feel watched, is what she said, observed and pressured. One night, though, things escalated. He said that the house felt like it was breathing, wood popping and groaning as if pushed from the inside, plates slid off counters, a chair toppled over. Then something, he never described what, hurled a stack of dishes toward him, and one clipped his cheek. That was enough. He did not try to confront it, he didn't grab anything. Instead, he just ran. The woods were black and moonless that night, and he said that he could hear something moving beside him the entire time that he was running. Not close enough to touch him, but never far enough to ignore it either. Whenever he slowed, the steps slowed too, and whenever he panicked and rushed ahead, the sounds rushed too, keeping pace and almost shepherding him forward, is the way that he put it. He didn't stop until he reached the road, and even then he claimed that the steps continued for a while, staying just inside the brush before fading completely. He showed up at my grandmother's porch at sunrise, exhausted, completely scraped up, and absolutely certain that he would never return to that house ever again. And he didn't, as far as she knew. Now, I used to think that these accounts were exaggerated, stories shaped by superstition, long nights, and fear, but the consistency is what really unsettles me about them. Different people, different decades, same sort of pattern, the sense of being mirrored in the woods by something that doesn't want to be seen, only known. Nobody around here tries to figure out what it is anymore. They don't call it a demon or a ghost or a creature. They don't give it a name at all, really. They just say that this part of the world has its own way of watching you, and sometimes that's enough to make a person move on. Most people who have heard the footsteps, they won't walk those roads alone after dark anymore. My uncle never hunted past dusk again, and that house in the woods, well, it's been empty for years now. The strangest part is just how normal these stories feel to the locals, I suppose, like acknowledging them in just another kind of weather report. I don't know what the follower is. Maybe no one ever really will, but if you ever find yourself walking a quiet mountain road at night and you notice something is keeping exact pace with you, most people around here would say, don't stop and do not look for it. When I was a kid, there was a particular summer that always sat in the back of my mind like an unresolved question. I was about 11, staying at my cousin's family retreat near Lake Jindabyne in the Snowy Mountains. They used it mostly in the winter for skiing, but in the warmer months it felt strangely empty, quiet in a way that forests usually aren't, and the day before everything happened, I had spent hours running along the lakeshore and splashing around in the freezing water, like I had something to prove. By evening, my legs were complete jelly, and I crashed early without even arguing for more time awake like I usually did. Sometime just before dawn, though, I snapped awake with a dry mouth and that sort of buzzing headache that you get when you're overheated. I checked around my room for the bottle of water that I usually kept near the bed, but I must have forgotten it. The house was dark and cold enough to feel like a different building as I stepped out into the hallway. My cousin's old kelpie, Myro, he trotted out from the bedroom as soon as he heard me moving. He was usually a quiet and pretty calm dog, always glued to whoever happened to be awake the earliest. I scratched his ears a little bit, switched on the light, and headed down toward the kitchen. Downstairs was basically one big sort of open layout. The staircase dropped into a wide living area, with a short hallway branching to the left that led to a broom closet, a small laundry, and a back door. The kitchen, that was tucked opposite that, separated only by a large archway. As I reached the middle of the staircase, Myro stopped, completely. His nails clicked once on the step, and then he locked his legs and stared hard into the dim hallway to the left. At first, I thought that he had heard something outside, but then he made a sound that I'd never heard him make before, a low rumbling sound that vibrated through his whole body. I paused halfway down and sort of followed his gaze, and there, standing just past the doorway of the laundry, was a figure. I don't mean a shadow, I mean something shaped like a person, but so dark that it didn't reflect the light the way that normal things do. No face, no clothes, no details, just a human outline filled with absolute darkness, like it was absorbing everything around it. It was motionless at first, and I remember thinking my body had just stopped working, and then it slowly lifted one arm. I can't say if it was gesturing for me to come closer or warning me to stay away, but the movement was so smooth and deliberate. After that, it sort of leaned slightly, pivoted, and slipped into the laundry room without making a sound. As soon as it vanished past the doorway, A spell that I was sort of in just broke. I tore back up the stairs so fast that I nearly fell, and I stood in the upstairs hallway trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But Myro's growl had been real, and he now would not leave my side. After a few minutes of staring down the stairs, I forced myself to go back down. Not because I was brave, but because I was a kid terrified of getting in trouble for waking the adults, and I flipped on every single light that I could reach for, one by one, and dragged Myro with me to the laundry, but when we got there was nothing. There was no sound outside either, no footprints anywhere, laundry room or otherwise, no sign that anything had been standing there at all, in fact. That's when the panic finally won out too for me, and I ran to my mum's room and just shook her awake. I tried explaining everything, but she was exhausted and didn't take it seriously. She told me that I was half asleep, imagining things. I accepted that explanation for a long time too, until years later. You see, my older brother, who had stayed in a separate guest cottage on the property that same summer, he told me something that I'd never heard before. That very morning, right around breakfast, he had gone into the main house to grab some food, and while he was standing at the bench pouring cereal, the entire room seemed to thicken around him, is what he said, like the air became heavy and it was hard to breathe. He said that it felt like someone was standing right behind him too, but not a person exactly, more like a presence that wanted to be noticed. And then, without warning, his vision just went. Not like fainting, but just blackness. 5 seconds of like nothing, and then everything returned to normal as if nothing had happened. He left the house shaking. He's gone to 2 different doctors since then, and he has no seizures, no neurological issues that he's aware of, and really just no explanation. And he didn't tell anyone at the time because, well, he didn't want to scare anyone. I still don't know what I saw. I mean, maybe sleep deprivation could pull a trick on a kid's brain like that, but I still cannot explain how Myro reacted. I cannot explain what happened to my brother, and although I'm skeptical by nature, there's a part of me that just cannot shake the idea that something in that house watched us that morning. Something that wasn't supposed to be there, and that didn't make a sound when it moved. I still drive past Lake Jindabyne from time to time. The house was sold years ago now, but every time I see that tree line, I remember that moment on those stairs, the dog trembling by my side like that, and that dark shape raising its arms as if acknowledging me. I will never forget it as long as I live, and it's something that sits with me really, really eerily. I never thought that it would happen to me. I always assumed that things like this happened to other people, the ones that you read about in the news, not someone sitting alone in their own home. But it did. It started small. At first, I thought it was just me being paranoid. A shadow at the edge of my yard, a knock at my door when no one should have been there, footsteps in the snow outside when I was sure that I'd locked everything tight. I told myself that it was nothing, just someone walking by, just the wind. Then I started seeing him. One night, around 2 a.m., I was brushing my teeth when I noticed a shape moving past the living room window, tall, thin, just standing there and staring. My heart stopped when I saw them. I froze, and then he vanished into the darkness of the trees behind the house. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched all the time, too. I started double-checking all the locks, installing extra lights, even sleeping with my phone in my hand. But nothing really seemed to help me. A few weeks later, it escalated too. I was in the kitchen, making a sandwich or something, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking on the carpet upstairs. My house is pretty small, and those footsteps should not have been there. Again, I froze, My stomach dropped, and whoever it was now inside of my house. I quickly grabbed the nearest object, a frying pan, and crept to the stairs. I saw him, a man standing at the top of the stairs, wild eyes, clothes dirtied as if he'd been hiding outside for weeks, and in his hand was a knife. I don't know how I found the courage, but I bolted. I ran downstairs, screaming and fumbling with the front door lock. I could hear him behind me, moving faster than I thought humanly possible. My heart was hammering and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the deadbolt when I got there. I threw the door open and ran into the street, shouting for help. I didn't look back, but I could hear him crash through the door behind me. So I ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on their door until they let me in. The police, they arrived within minutes, and they found him inside, cornered in the kitchen, still holding that knife. Later, one of the officers told me that he was a previously convicted offender with a history of assaults and stalking, recently released from prison apparently. He had been hiding in the woods behind my house, watching me for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I went back home weeks later after staying with my parents for a little while, and the place has just never felt the same. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. The thrill of exploring somewhere forgotten, the dust and the decay, the feeling that the walls themselves are holding secrets. I cannot explain why, but I just sort of find it addicting. My friend Marcus feels the same way too, and we've spent countless weekends sneaking into factories, old hospitals, and deserted schools. But nothing we'd ever done compared to what happened this night. So it started around 9 p.m., late October, driving down a cracked back road with our lights bouncing off the fog. Marcus had heard of rumors of an old chapel tucked into the woods behind a now abandoned farm out here. The farm, it had burned down years ago allegedly, leaving only charred beams and overgrown weeds. Nobody went there, which was perfect for urbexing. We parked the car and grabbed our gear and hiked through the undergrowth. The forest was eerily quiet, and I remember that detail. But after about 20 minutes, we stumbled across it, a small stone structure hidden under ivy with a crumbling bell tower. The door was hung off of its hinges. "This place is insane," Marcus whispered. "Looks untouched for decades." Inside, the chapel smelled of mold and smoke, the floor littered with broken pews and shattered glass. At first, it was just the usual abandoned vibe. But then we found the altar. It wasn't a typical religious altar by any means. It was a rough stone slab, blackened at the edges, surrounded by symbols etched into the floor and the walls, shapes that I didn't like the look of. Candles were half melted and caked with dust. They were also arranged in a strange circle, and around them were remnants of what looked like dried herbs, feathers, and bones. "What the hell is this?" I breathed. Marcus knelt, brushing away a layer of dirt. I think it's maybe a ritual site or something. Maybe a cult's been here. Look at these marks. They're fresh, or fresh-ish, not decades old. I swallowed hard. Something about that moment felt wrong. The hairs on my neck stood up, and then I heard something. It sounded like somebody walking around outside, just beyond the shattered windows. "Probably hunters, right?" Marcus said nervously. But I knew that it wasn't. The footsteps were deliberate, and there were way too many at once to be just one person. And then a low synchronized chant echoed throughout the trees all of a sudden. I grabbed Marcus and whispered under my breath, "We need to go now." We backed out slowly, trying not to make a noise, but as soon as we hit the clearing, I saw them, figures in dark hooded robes, holding what looked like knives that were glinting in flashlight beams. There were at least 6 of them, moving silently yet with purpose. "Run," I said, and we bolted into the woods. Branches whipped our faces, roots snagged our feet, but we didn't stop. Behind us, we could hear voices mingled with footsteps and the occasional hiss. My lungs were literally burning as I was running, adrenaline pumping harder than anything that I'd ever felt. But we darted over a fallen log, splashed through a shallow creek, and finally hit the old farm road. I didn't look back, but I couldn't hear the distant pounding of boots in the undergrowth for a long time after that. We didn't stop running until the fog swallowed the forest behind us, and we swore that we would never come back here ever again. Marcus and I still talk about it sometimes, but we never really share details with anyone else. And some things we've now realized just aren't meant to be explored. This all started in February of 2023 when I matched with a guy named Aaron, 23 and male, on a dating app while I was living in Manchester, UK. At first, he presented himself in a very controlled way. He asked questions, remembered details, and kept telling me that he appreciated that I was straightforward. I didn't see anything alarming right then. He was studying economics in a university in Edinburgh, played a sport, and overall seemed pretty normal. The first time we met, though, things felt off, but not dangerous, I would say. He brought up an old exam score out of nowhere, talked repeatedly about how my face turned red easily, and put a nicotine patch in my mouth without asking. He pocketed my lighter and later admitted that he did it so that he'd have a reason to talk to me again. He mentioned a history of losing a large amount of money betting on sports or something, and I brushed these things aside because he otherwise acted reasonably polite. Since he lived in another city, we only saw each other every now and then when he came back to his hometown, which happened every few weeks or so. The third time that we met, he invited me out and showed up over 2 hours late and took me to a cheap pizza place where he ate quickly and barely asked about me. Afterward, he told me that he used to drink heavily and had gone through rehab programs twice, allegedly. He also said that he got one of his scars from starting an argument with a stranger's girlfriend years earlier and then getting knocked off of his bike while running away. He was also visibly irritated that I was wearing a man's coat and had cut my hair shorter since the last time that he saw me. And despite all of that, and I know it looks pretty stupid, we eventually became exclusive. When I agreed, he cried, though, and said that he had never been so relieved. That same night, too, he told me that his family was extremely wealthy and that he was expected to inherit a significant amount someday or something. Well, over the next 6 months, I got a much clearer picture of what was actually going on in his life. He had access to a lot of money, but had no understanding of budgeting. He would buy last-minute train tickets for hundreds of pounds, take taxis everywhere, and spend through his parents' accounts as if nothing had a cost. His family, they paid him high hourly wages to do simple tasks, yet he was always out of money somehow. His mother bought him designer clothing that he never used, and he treated it like it was all disposable. As a boyfriend, he was completely unreliable and demanding. He frequently hid his interactions with other women as well, and he reacted very poorly to being told no. He would tell stories from his past, including experimenting with hard drugs given by dealers or something, losing large amounts of money to schemes, and being robbed by people that he'd hired for sex, and describing it all without so much as a hint of remorse. About 3 months into the relationship, he started gambling again too. That's when I understood the scales of his issues, and he spent every possible hour at casinos. He stayed out all night, sometimes 12 hours straight, or skipped work obligations to gamble during the day. He lost significant amounts of money without anyone in his family realizing. He kept implying that he knew my card PIN as well and how much I had in my account. And because he owed money to people that I didn't know, I changed all my login information to be safe. Well, 2 months after that, his father's drinking escalated and the father ended up in a rehabilitation program himself. Aaron began drinking again shortly after, and within 2 weeks he broke up with me and then immediately slept with another woman. I only learned this later when he accidentally showed me a photo that he'd taken with her the same day that he had ended things. By the end of his relapse, he was intoxicated constantly and would call me just to insult me or to try to intimidate me. His family didn't know that he had started drinking again, mind you, so I ended up informing his sister. They checked him into the same rehab center that his father had gone to, which cost a lot, but the facility said that they couldn't house both at once, and his father chose to stay, so Aaron was moved to a cheaper location. When he eventually left rehab and went to a halfway house, I told him that I didn't want a relationship anymore with him. He immediately walked out of the program and came to my house, though, and I told him to leave, but it was clear that he wasn't accepting the breakup. A few weeks later, I found out about the other woman and also realized that he had lied about multiple events earlier in our relationship too. When I ended things permanently, that was when he reacted aggressively. He threatened to send intimate photos of me to my family and workplace. He tried to demand £800 in cash, claiming that I owed it to him for dates that we had gone on, even though we paid evenly most of the time. He threatened to file police reports if I didn't pay him. Then he told me that he could have me involuntarily committed under a law that turned out to not apply in the UK at all. And when I blocked him everywhere, he contacted me through my Spotify account and threatened me over an event that he wanted me to attend with him. He also suggested that he had placed a recording device in my room and implied that he had given me an STI. At that point, it was obvious that he was completely unstable and capable of very unpredictable behavior. So I cut contact entirely. Looking back, I know that I should have left much earlier, but I'm very glad that I did leave when I did. There were enough warning signs in the first month to justify just walking away, but stupidly I didn't, and the situation escalated in ways that, genuinely, while I probably should have seen it, didn't expect it. There are many other things that he did that I haven't included here, such as suing his university for failing courses that he never submitted work for, his fixation on his younger brother's body, and dealing with his ex-girlfriend who harassed me throughout the relationship all the time. But I'm just relieved that it's over, and the only value that it has now is as a bit of a reminder of what happens when you ignore early indicators that somebody is clearly not stable. This incident took place in late August of 2022, a few weeks after I left a warehouse job in Leeds, UK. I needed short-term income while figuring out my next step, so I went back to working for a food delivery app. I'd done similar work during 2020 and also early 2021, and remember it being pretty straightforward. It gave me enough control over my hours and didn't require dealing with co-workers, which suited me. Peak demand in my area usually ran from about maybe 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., and the pay was acceptable given the hours. One night at around 12:20 in the morning, I received a notification for a delivery. The payout was pretty reasonable, so I accepted it without thinking too much. Now, the first irregularity appeared immediately. The customer name displayed a long string of sort of random characters. I had seen initial and fake names before, but not something that looked like a keyboard mash. I assumed the app must have been glitched. This order required a direct handoff too, which I usually tried to avoid because it increased the chance of an awkward interaction. Still, the restaurant had the bag ready when I arrived, so the pickup was quick. According to the map, the drop-off was on the far edge of a district that I hadn't delivered to before. older housing, low visibility at night, very little foot traffic. When I turned onto the street, the situation felt different from typical late-night deliveries too. Many of the buildings looked partially vacant, and only one low-output streetlight provided minimal visibility. I parked as close as possible to the indicated door, reversing into the space so that I could leave quickly if needed. This is something that I always do for safety. I walked the short distance to the unit and I knocked. I heard faint movement inside after a few seconds. The door opened and a woman appeared. She looked around maybe her mid-30s, very thin, and had like several cuts or scabs on her hands and forearms. Her mouth area looked discolored, but I couldn't determine the cause, but the interior behind her was completely dark, except for a faint light from a screen deeper inside the room. I greeted her and I held out the bag. She didn't respond verbally or with any clear expression. Her eyes didn't focus in a typical way. They seemed unfocused, like she wasn't processing much of what she was seeing. After a long pause, she took the bag slowly but continued staring straight at me. This wasn't typical hesitation or social discomfort too. It felt like she wasn't fully aware of the interaction almost. I ended the exchange and returned to my car at a fast pace, but as soon as I shut the car door, I locked it and checked around the vehicle to make sure that nobody else was nearby. And when I pulled forward to leave, I glanced at the row of windows along the building and I saw her standing at the window, watching my car as I drove off, and I saw a dark, crouched shadow at the back of my vehicle. I ended my shift early that night because of the situation, and the combination of the unreadable customer name, the unusual state of the property, the woman's behavior, the dark shadow behind my vehicle, none of it fit a pattern of normal odd deliveries. I couldn't determine whether she was under the influence or something else. Maybe injured, maybe she was in trouble, or maybe she was dealing with a medical issue. Whatever the explanation was for her, the fact that I saw that dark shadow behind my vehicle, that was obviously an attempt to either steal my car or mug me or something. For anyone considering doing app-based delivery work, the income can be helpful, but there are unpredictable situations that you need to be aware of and be careful of. Most, thankfully, are pretty harmless, but occasionally you encounter something like this. Something that feels significantly outside the normal boundaries. And unfortunately, for me, this was one of those nights. I don't usually talk about anything from my school years, but something happened when I was a teenager that still bothers me. And the older that I get, the more that I recognize just how unusual the entire situation was. When I was in school in Tucson, Arizona, I had a reputation for being pretty quiet. I rarely initiated conversations, and most social interactions made me nervous enough that I replayed them afterwards to check if I had said something wrong or done something wrong. So, because of this, I spent a lot of time with the school counselor. Her name was Miss Lawson, and she was patient and easy to talk to. My mother trusted her completely, and after I moved on to middle school, we still exchanged the occasional message online just to sort of stay in touch. By the time that I was in higher grades, I wasn't the same withdrawn kid anymore at all. I was on the school robotics team, enrolled in higher level classes, and trying to maintain a normal social life. I also ended up dating a guy named Drew, who in hindsight was controlling and generally not good for me. He attended a vocational program connected to our high school at the time, which apparently offered a list of trade-focused courses or something. Drew had signed up for the public safety and law program, and the instructor running his cohort happened to be Mrs. Lawson's husband, a man named Mark. Mark was a hard miss. He had the build of someone who had spent most of his free time at the gym, and Drew always said that he used to compete in strength competitions. Drew talked about him constantly, describing him as a bit of a mentor. Because I knew his wife, the situation didn't feel strange at first, and eventually the two of us were invited to their house for dinner one weekend. It seemed unusual for two teachers to host two students on their own, but given the historical circumstances, at the time I really didn't question it. They had two young kids, both involved in youth gymnastics, which meant most of the evening I spent answering their questions about cheer practice, school events, things like this. Nothing inappropriate happened too, and I didn't really think much about it afterwards. A couple of days later, Mark followed me on social media and occasionally liked my posts. At the time, I assumed he was just being friendly because of Drew, and because his wife had known me since I was young. A few weeks later, he sent me a message asking if I would come by sometime and help his daughters with some basic tumbling practice. I didn't think of it as anything too unusual, and I told him that I would consider it, and really that was pretty much the end of it, or at least that's what I assumed at the time. So about a year passed, and I eventually broke up with Drew after realizing just how badly the relationship was affecting me. I still saw Mark occasionally at the public school events because his daughters performed at some of the same venues. When he did message me, it was usually only to comment about a competition or ask if our team was attending certain meets or stuff like that. Again, nothing seemed off to me. But then, during maths class one morning, the intercom came on and requested that I report to the main office. I had never been called down there before, so as soon as I grabbed my bag, my phone began vibrating with messages from my stepfather, all referencing photographs that I did not recognize. My anxiety spiked immediately too, and when I reached the main office, I saw my mother visibly upset, a detective standing beside her, and a large folder on the desk. The detective explained that during a separate investigation involving Mark, they had seized his phone, and inside they found a large collection of photos of me. The folder on the desk was filled with printed copies. I didn't open it, and no one forced me to. I didn't want to see anything inside of it, to be honest. But from what little I was told, the images were collected over a long period of time. Some were taken from my social media account, others weren't, but the detective didn't explain every detail, only that the evidence was substantial enough that the school board had removed him from the position immediately. I wasn't contacted again after that day, and no one from the school brought it up to me afterwards either, which I was grateful for. The entire event, though, it still feels very disconnected from the rest of my life, like something that happened to somebody else and not me. Obviously, I never visited his home again, and I definitely never responded to any more messages from him. Mind you, I don't think he ever actually tried to contact me ever again. But yeah, I'm grateful that our paths never crossed again either, and I'm glad that the situation ended there before, well, anything worse happened. People talk a lot about gut instinct, like it's some sort of mystical sixth sense or something. But when you're young, you often mistake that feeling for nerves or maybe overthinking. I learned the difference the hard way during the winter of 2020, when I was 19 and studying illustration at a small arts institute in Edinburgh. Back then, life was simple. I commuted from my mum's flat, attended workshops, spent evenings sketching with my classmates. I genuinely believed that I was street smart. What happened that night proved that I wasn't nearly as sharp as I really thought, though. One of our lecturers encouraged us to visit a Renaissance exhibit at the National Gallery of Scotland, a rare collection on loan from Florence. A few girls from my studio group suggested that we all go together after class. So, we wrapped up at around 5:30 p.m, grabbed a cheap dinner near the Royal Mile, and had a couple of drinks before making our way to the museum. I wasn't drunk by any means, but I definitely wasn't thinking clearly either, especially after barely eating all day. The exhibition was incredible though, and we spent a couple of hours sketching figures and discussing brushwork like proper art nerds do. By the time that we left, the city was fully dark now, and everyone peeled off toward their own bus or tram. I personally headed for the train that would take me out to Livingston, where I was living with my mum at the time. Only when I sat down on the carriage did I notice that my phone battery was circling the drain at about 14% now. My emergency power bank was useless without a cable as well, a cable that I now remembered leaving plugged into one of the classroom outlets earlier that morning. I asked our class group chat if anyone was still at the school and to check for it, and after a few minutes someone sent a picture confirming that they had found it and would bring it to me the next day. That solved the missing charger problem, but not the more immediate one. Waking up for my now 8 a.m. studio critique with a dead phone and no alarm. Everyone else in the house slept like a rock, and no one was going to accidentally wake up as well. So I sighed, trying to come up with a bit of a plan, and finally turned to the man sitting in the seat beside me. He looked to be in his maybe mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and a backpack decorated with bright cartoon fruit patterns. I asked if he had a charging cable that I could borrow until one of us got off, and unfortunately he told me that he didn't, then suggested checking the kiosk at the next station. When we rolled in, the metal shutters were already down unfortunately, so he leaned towards me slightly and said, almost casually, "I've got one at my flat. It's right next to the stop where I'm getting off." I really should have declined. I know that. I should have changed seats. I mean, heck, even changed carriages. But I was tired, a little bit tipsy and frustrated. So instead of thinking it through, I mumbled, "Yeah, alright." In my head, the plan was quick and simple. He hands me the cable at his door, I charge my phone with my power bank while waiting outside, then hand it back and I leave. Even that idea didn't make much sense, but I clung to it anyway because the alternative was admitting that this was a really bad idea. When the train reached the stop, I followed him out into the winter night. The cold, it slapped me hard enough to jolt a little bit of clarity into my brain, but not enough to overcome the weird autopilot that I'd fallen into now. The street was quiet, the station nearly empty. Without hesitation, he said, "Come on," and headed toward the nearby tram station. My chest tightened a bit, and every part of me was now whispering to turn around, go home, and that something was wrong. But I didn't. I trailed behind him like I'd rehearsed the route. We caught a tram that carried us into a residential area then, that I'd never been on or even seen before. As the city lights thinned, the tight feeling in my ribs grew heavier. He talked the entire ride, small talk, nothing significant, but I barely heard a word. I kept thinking, you can leave at the next stop, just stand up and walk off. But the second that the doors opened, my legs just refused to cooperate. We eventually got off a quiet stop, surrounded by tall apartment blocks. He led the way through a narrow path lined with wet hedges, then stopped at the entrance gate of a large complex. He tapped a fob against the reader, the metal gate buzzed, and he slipped inside. I stayed planted on the pavement outside, frozen, wondering how in the world I'd let myself get this far. He glanced back, looking confused. "What are you waiting for? Just come in." Every logical thought told me to not move. Yet, I stepped forward. The path inside stretched much further than I expected, a long courtyard with dim lamps, barely lighting the way toward a cluster of buildings. His building was the one farthest from the gate. No neighbors in sight, no noise, except the wind and his footsteps now. You could scream, I thought, but who would hear you here? We climbed to the second floor. He unlocked his door, walked in, and held it open for me. I stood at the threshold, fighting a rising wave of panic now. He didn't look impatient or threatening, just expectant, like this was the most ordinary situation in the world. I walked in. The flat was cramped, cluttered, and smelled faintly of stale takeaway food. The bed took up half the space, clothes were piled everywhere, and the kitchenette in the corner looked like it hadn't been cleaned in days. He handed me the cable that he pulled out of a drawer, then vanished into the bathroom. My phone was now at 7%. The cable also barely worked. I had to hold it at a very specific angle just to get a slow charge. And that was when my heart dropped fully into my stomach. I mean, I was in a stranger's flat, and no one knew that I was even with anyone. He came back and sat right beside me on the bed, cutting off the only path to the exit now. I kept my jacket and pack on, and I told him that I'd only stay for a moment. He smiled and said that I could crash here if I wanted. I declined immediately. Then, without warning, his hand landed on my thigh. I felt my throat close. I needed an excuse, any excuse, to call for help without setting him off. So I pulled out my phone, praying that it had enough charge to make a call, and dialed my mother. I forced myself to talk as if nothing strange was happening, recounting the exhibition, pretending that I was already on my way home. Behind me, though, his hand stayed exactly where it was. When my mum said that she was tired and needed to sleep, my internal panic spiked. As soon as she hung up, I turned slightly and saw him staring at me while doing something that I won't describe, but I felt sick. I immediately called my dad. I don't even remember half of what I said, mostly filler talk about my day, making sure to say "Dad" repeatedly to know the man knew exactly who I was speaking to. My dad noticed my unsteady breathing and asked if I was running. I lied and said that I was hurrying for the train, and then I used that lie to stand up. "All right, Dad, I need to run. Please stay on the phone, yeah?" I got to my feet, the charger yanked out of the wall as I moved. I told the man that I had to go. The apartment door wouldn't open, though, and I hadn't even realized that it locked automatically from the inside when I had come in. When I froze, he slowly got up, walked over, and unlocked it. Before I could slip past, he murmured, "Come visit again," and brushed his lips against my neck. I ducked under his arm, and he slapped me as I left. I bolted, down the stairs, across the courtyard, out through the gate, which thankfully didn't require a code to exit. I didn't stop running until I reached the tram stop. The tram arrived immediately, like the universe finally decided to throw me a bit of a lifeline, and only once was I sitting inside did I tell my dad that I was now safe. By the time that I got home, it was 10 p.m. Everybody was asleep, as I knew they would be. I went straight to my room, shaking so badly that I could barely remove my shoes, and I didn't tell anyone except for a close friend, and even then, not until at least a year later. For months, I replayed everything that could have gone wrong that night, and just how stupid I was, how easily things could have escalated, and how stupidly far I'd let myself be led like that. But the lesson stuck. That sinking feeling in your stomach, it isn't imagination, it's survival instinct, and ignoring it is a luxury that you really only get once. I still think about that night sometimes, not in a dramatic way, but more in a sense of, how did I not see the danger until it surrounded me like that? Now I treat intuition like a warning siren, not a passing thought. I don't follow strangers. I don't let politeness override common sense either. And I do not, under any circumstances, leave myself without a working phone charger. Looking back, I was dumb, young, and it was a really stupid move. I cannot believe I even let myself into that situation. But I got lucky that night, and I got out. And now, I use this story to tell others, especially younger people, as a warning. Be careful and don't do anything silly like I did. Nothing about that day should have stood out. It was warm, a little bit muggy, the kind of weather where everything still feels slightly out of focus, but I remember every detail like it was carved into glass. Classes had wrapped up the week before, and with the break coming up, I'd been trying to reconnect with people that I hadn't seen in months now. One of them was Liam, someone that I'd grown up with in Newcastle, Australia. We had that sort of friendship where silence was no longer awkward, but we'd also go long stretches without catching up. We'd usually follow a simple ritual when we did meet: grab something small to eat, sit near the wharf, talk about whatever had happened since we had last spoke, and then walk around until the city lights started flickering on. Every time it felt easy and familiar. But the moment that I spotted him waiting near the ferry terminal that day, something felt wrong. Not with him and not with us, but just something about the situation was pulling in the back of my head. I blamed myself at first. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the heat was getting to me or something. But then, as casually as if he was commenting on the weather, Liam muttered, "Do you feel like everything's a bit off today?" It was like someone had opened a trap door under my ribs. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice didn't sound like mine. He didn't elaborate, just stared down the street, unsettled in a way that I had never seen from him before. And somehow that made it worse. We tried to keep things normal though. We bought some iced drinks, talked about uni, about random people that we both used to know. But this whole time I just felt awkward, like we were standing somewhere where we weren't supposed to be. Then my mother rang, asking me to check the price of a second-hand laptop at a shop a few streets away. I told myself that once we did that, we'd head home early. We did the errand, nothing strange happened, and yet when it came time to split, we didn't. We decided, against every instinct, to take our usual long walk through King Street and down toward the quieter residential stretch. That was the last moment that we could have gone home without stepping into, well, what followed. The further that we walked, the more I realized that something was very, very wrong. King Street is usually busy, even on a slow night, but it was completely deserted. Not a single person walking, no cars rolling by, nothing open, well, except for the occasional neon sign buzzing like it was struggling to stay lit. We turned into a quiet road, planning to loop towards the edge of a civic park, and as we crossed, I noticed two men stepping out from behind the corner building. They didn't speak and they didn't look around. They just sort of moved exactly as we did, keeping a steady distance. At first, I tried to rationalize it. People walk in the same direction all the time, after all. But then a second detail hit me. They weren't walking with any purpose. There was no phone, no conversation, no gestures, just sweeping behind us like shadows trying to keep in time. As the road sloped downward toward the park, I nudged Liam and quietly said, "Don't turn around suddenly, but I think that those guys are following us." He did look, though, way too quickly. "Let's cross," he whispered. "If they follow, then we'll know." So we crossed, and they did too. Except when they stepped onto our side of the street, their posture changed. One of them sped up, pulling something small from their pocket. He didn't even try to hide it. The other drifted outward, cutting off the path behind us now. Before I had time to react, the one with the item in his hand now, he was directly in front of us, spreading his fingers in a gesture that meant stop without needing to say it. "We don't need noise," he said, voice low. "Hand everything over and we'll walk away. Don't, and this turns bad quickly." My vision tunneled. I could see their shapes, but not their faces. I remember thinking about my family, my partner, the dog that we had adopted just weeks earlier. I remember thinking that I should have hugged my mum that morning, even though I'd been in a rush and barely spoke. I held out my phone without argument, too stunned to say anything. But beside me, Liam made a choice that I never expected him to make. He bolted. The men shouted, and one lunged toward him and the other turned toward me, and that broke whatever trance that I had fallen into. Hearing Liam yell "run" was like someone hitting a switch inside my skull. So I ran. I'm not sure how far, but at one point my foot caught an uneven pavement and I crashed down so hard that I thought that I'd cracked something. Behind me, one of them yelled to the other, "Finish him, just do it." I remember thinking that I was about to hear a gunshot, certain that that sound would be the last thing that my brain ever registered. But nothing happened. No bang, no footsteps catching up, just my heartbeat, now absolutely skyrocketing. Somehow I got up and I kept running until my lungs burned. We didn't stop until we reached the busier part of town, somewhere near Derby Street. People were finally around, staring at us as if we were out of our minds, and all I could do was just sort of shout for help, voice breaking, barely coherent. Once we'd explained enough for somebody to understand, a woman waiting for her partner outside of a restaurant walked us to her car and she drove us home. I never did get her name, I just remember how calm she was and how she didn't ask any unnecessary questions. When my mum opened the door, she looked like she had seen a ghost. I hugged her so tightly that she kept asking what had happened. The next morning, things felt ordinary, well, sort of, again. Sunlight in the kitchen, birds outside, the usual weekend chatter in the streets, but something had changed in me. A fuse had blown somewhere deep down for sure. Liam and I stayed friends afterward, but it was never the same. Not really. I couldn't bring myself to walk around at night anymore, and, well, he never did argue with that.